An artifact is a man-made object that has some kind of importance in terms of cultural significance. Artifacts can be tools, portraits, sculptures made by people from that specific time period. These artifacts showcased in museums gives us a glimpse of how the world was before our time. It offers a tangible mean on where we came from. The importance of artifact preservation lets us connect with our history, both recent and ancient past. Although these means do not specifically give us a well-constructed depiction of history, it is still a relevant output to cater to our ideas of it. With the significance we place on these artifacts, it is vital for us in the sense of physical validation we have on our past. The aims of these museums vary, ranging from the different influences and cultural affiliations that the specific place has. It holds cultural wealth in terms of preservation of these items, which caters to institutional welfare of museums.
What are museums? The International Council of Museums is a non-governmental international organization of museums that spans 118 member countries, including the Philippines. It establishes professional and ethical standards for museum activities, gives insights on issues related to cultural heritage, and aids in the development of the global museum scene. Because of the scope of its membership and the corresponding responsibilities, the International Council of Museums, or ICOM for short, has a set of statutes that every member must adhere to. One of these is the definition of what a museum is. ICOM's current museum definition is the result of a 2007 General Assembly in Vienna. And I quote, "A museum is a non-profit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment." In accordance to this definition, it appears that the main purpose of the museum is to preserve and give accessibility to the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity. The museum, therefore, is not an active agent, but a passive conduit for propagating heritage. While heritage encompasses many things, one of its many essential components is art. According to Alice Guillermo's Art and Society, there is no universal definition of art. The way art is interpreted varies with respect to its socio-historical context. This position on art opposes that of formalism, which posits art as a self-contained entity distinct from the real world. Our class discussions affirm support for a contextualist position on art. Given art's inseparability from its context, and the museum's intimate relationship with art, a contextualist position finds weakness in the current definition of a museum. By being on the side of neutrality, the museum bottlenecks art's true expression by disconnecting it from its socio-historical context. Indeed, recently, there have been debates within ICOM on whether to expand the 2007 definition of museums. Presented below is the drafted definition by the Executive Board, and I quote, "Museums are democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the pasts and the futures. Acknowledging and addressing the conflicts and challenges of the present, they hold artifacts and specimens in trust for society, safeguard diverse memories for future generations, and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people." Museums are not for profit. They are participatory and transparent, and work in active partnership with and for diverse communities to collect, preserve, research, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understandings of the world, aiming to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. End quote. Opponents of this new definition have two major criticisms. First, it is too political, and second, it is too lengthy. Supporters of the new definition, on the other hand, think that the redefinition is appropriate in order to adapt to a changing 21st century. These arguments can be scrutinized using class discussions and academic journals. Those claiming that the new definition is too political are adherents to the old museum definition that advocates for a neutral stance. Yet our class discussion support for a contextualist position already sees this neutral stance as weak, as mentioned in the preceding discussion. Furthermore, according to our class discussions, there is no such thing as neutral or non-political. If the thing exists, it has an inherent political stance. If museums appear to be apolitical or neutral, this being apolitical is their political stance. Neutrality nonetheless is hard to achieve in museums because its space is only limited. If you display works of a certain theme, you are inevitably supporting one voice at the expense of the other. Museum and politics are therefore inseparable. Academic articles, on the other hand, support the claim that there is a need for museums to adapt to the 21st century. A 2019 article by Akbar, published in the journal Wakana, concluded that museums are currently in the age of disruption and they must adapt in order to remain relevant. The present era mandatorily calls for a change in how museums work, or they would risk becoming outdated by contemporary forms of heritage appreciation. Despite these seemingly supportive arguments for the new definition, opponents have a point in saying that it is not concise and that it is full of buzzwords. At the end of the day, the question to be answered is, what is a museum? We believe that the proposed new definition can be further distilled to create a much concise definition. And, I quote, museums are non-profit, proactive, and inclusive cultural agents that aim to collect, preserve, research, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understandings of the world in order to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. End quote.
Before assessing whether this definition is reflective of the role which the National Museum assumes in the Philippines, it is important to discuss what the museum claims itself to be. The National Museum in general seeks to act as an interdisciplinary institution that disseminates scientific and technical knowledge to the general public, promotes and conducts scientific research and development, and preserves the artistic, historical, and cultural heritage of the Philippines with the overall vision of unifying the Filipino people and imbibing them with a sense of pride and nationalism. The National Museum of Fine Arts is housed in the old Legislative Building in Ermita, Manila. In mid-1996, the Senate of the Philippines moved out of the building. In 2003, renovations started to transform it into the National Museum of Fine Arts. The institution does not formally define what classifies fine arts, but they describe the collection as housing visual art pieces ranging from easel paintings, sculptures, icons, sketches, and mixed media, starting from the 7th century up to the present. Their supposed criteria of selection are the following: uniqueness of style, prestige of the artist, and the significance of the artwork in the development of Philippine art. The division of the art exhibition sought to be arranged in a diachronic manner, beginning with religious art during Spanish colonial period, which is followed by romantic and neoclassical art after the rise of academism, obviously adhering to Western art movements. The American period is represented by works of Fernando Amorsolo and other pre-modernist artists who explored on paintings with genre themes, landscapes, and still lifes. There is also a section dedicated for artworks about the conflicts and horrors of World War II. The third level of the museum, also called the Senate floor, showcases modernist works of Victorio Edades, Guillermo Tolentino, Arturo Luz, and other national artists. Halls of that floor also showcase more contemporary works featuring techniques like abstractionism, abstract expressionism, figurative expressionism, and other more.
Considering such kind of art collection, it is not inapparent how the National Museum of Fine Art can seem as a problematic institution in many ways. First, a lot of its galleries are filled with artworks, the majority of which were either produced by prominent figures in Philippine art, whose hometowns were Manila, or outsourced from the towns of Luzon. Here we have rooms for the elite artists like Juan Luna, Felix Resurrecion Hidalgo, Fernando Amorsolo, Vicente Manansala, and Ben Cab, among others. Now, the inclusion of these artists and their numerous pieces is not necessarily a bad thing. However, the collection of the National Museum of Fine Art becomes a cause of concern when we begin to notice the divisive categorization or labeling of these artworks. On the one hand, it presents an array of representative pieces of Philippine portraiture, depictions of the Second World War, sculptures, modernist art, which were undoubtedly gathered from Manila, whereas on the other hand, we have artworks made by a Bohol master, or artworks that were from the Visayan region, as if they were their own classification and apart from the humongous exhibition that centered on Manila, which did not need any further naming or explanation with regard to their Filipino identity. Through this, the vision and face of Manila becomes the vision and face of the Philippines, as if to say, here's a Filipino and here's a Visayan. Which brings us to another issue. The museum is artist and figure centric. It holds a bubble wrap of exclusivity within the community of what it prided as prestigious artists and historical celebrities like Jose Rizal. It houses the Noli Me Tangere and Jose Rizal exhibits and devotes at least 2 to 3 rooms for a veneered artist like Vicente Manansala. Meters and meters of space are allotted for these people that even the simplest of their drawings and paint easels are hosted at the museum. Such an attitude is rather absurd and anti-self. By capping its collection to these individuals, it delimits the display of Philippine art to the lens and talents of a selected few, especially those who came from Manila. The artistic ingenuity of other Filipinos, that of lesser known artists, and people of other towns and provinces who undoubtedly also participated on what the museum mentioned as Philippine art's historical development, is pushed to the sidelines, blatantly erased from this narrative by the bouldering superiority of the current members of the established circle, leading to a narrow representation of the true Filipino identity. Thus, we arrive at our next concern. Is the National Museum of Fine Art actually neutral? We may assume that the divisions of art exhibits within the gallery are an objective arrangement, if not a lazy motivation to preserve and display, of works of art that present the various art techniques, styles, or movements like portraiture modernism, or to present the distinguishable themes or subject matter of our art history, or to laud our great artists. Thus, in this case, the museum becomes an institution, a place to contain and give access to what it deems historical or remarkable. However, as we have noted earlier, the selection of artworks seen in this museum is banking off a partial and tremendously insufficient, hence incorrect, presentation of the Filipino identity, which brings us to the final question. Is the National Museum of Fine Art participating in the furthering of a certain political agenda? Is this Tagalog-centric and stereotype collection a sign of the museum's complicity to this hegemonic end in Philippine art? Or can the institution be ignorant of this servicing political color, aiming only to be historical with its disorganized organization? If it is the latter, then that introduces us to a convoluted situation. The National Museum of Fine Art, as the medium of the nation to its social, political, cultural, and artistic history, should be already informed of its critical role and widespread influence to the people. As the caretaker and presenter of our cultural heritage, and a promoter of the Filipino identity, it must bear in mind the gravity of the very acts it performs. It cannot simply be neutral, complicit, or worse, ignorant, for all acts are political. Its silence is a stand, and its ignorance a proof of its negligence and irresponsibility.
It is not unmerited that museums ought to be non-profit, proactive, inclusive cultural agents that aim to collect, preserve, research, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understanding of the world in order to contribute to human dignity, social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. Given the considerations mentioned prior, the museum cannot be simply passive, in danger of being complicit in the misrepresentation or the complete lack of representation of the different elements and actors that make up a national identity. Museums, being cultural agents, should be initiators of conversation, with neutrality not being an excuse to haphazardly present easily accessible works or artifacts in fear of inciting any political agenda, but an active presentation of different voices. In this case, being neutral is not the lack of a political stance, but a stance in itself, as long as the museum's neutrality is oriented towards an exposition of the socio-political, cultural, and historical realities of its context. The museum necessarily has to have a political stance, and this stance creates an avenue for the viewer to participate in active discourse. The museum does not have a stance simply for the sake of having one. Ergo, it is not political just to say that it is not apolitical, but in order to promote human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. In the case of the National Museum of Fine Arts, all aspects of Philippine society throughout history ought to have a political stance. What is this stance? It is not to promote, say, the Spanish heritage or the atrocities of the Japanese occupation, but rather the very promotion of the Filipino identity is its political stance. Showcasing different types of artwork throughout history and throughout the country may seem too neutral and apolitical. However, we have to go back to the museum's very goal: to open avenues for discourse, not merely showcase a certain group of art and leave the audience to interpret them on their own. Taking part in the museum's influence as a socio-cultural institution, the audience has to be given all the tools necessary for discourse, which includes them being able to see all different kinds of artworks, as well as the truth behind these works. The National Museum omitting different artworks from different periods, areas, and ethno-linguistic groups may not be deliberate. However, the fact that there is an omission of artworks, an omission of voices, the museum limits the opportunity for a fruitful and genuine discourse.
To reiterate, the National Museum vows to protect, preserve, and disseminate the legacy of the Filipino people. Let us say that a Muslim Filipino from Mindanao were to visit the National Museum. Will he or she resonate with the Filipino legacy that the institution ought to communicate? Or would he or she not question his or her own sense of being a Filipino, even though the art collections found in a museum are evidently dominated by artworks with Christian religious themes and historical narratives centered on the pueblo? Would he or she be proud and dignified after having viewed these works and confidently say, I am a Filipino, after exiting the museum? If there is a hesitation to positively respond to these questions, then ultimately, the National Museum has failed to serve its mission. Although the National Museum also have 19 regional branches across the country, there is little to no information about them in the institution's website, nor a promotion of any sort inside the branches. While a branch in Manila merits the name of the National Museum of Fine Arts, of Natural History, or of Anthropology, those located in Sulu or Albay is labeled as a regional branch. Who gets to decide what belongs to the National Museum and what gets deployed in the regional branches? There is obviously a need to review the process of deliberation in choosing what artworks to be placed in the National Museum, which is considerate and representative of the diverse historical and cultural heritage of the Philippines. While the National Museum of Fine Arts is the art division of the National Museum, it does not mean that their only purpose is to preserve, maintain, and display art. The National Museum also claims itself as a scientific and educational institution, which carries the implication that they also have the responsibility to actively research, enhance, and even challenge the understanding of Filipino history and socio-political conditions, and not merely rely on conventional narratives. These tasks are not independent. The fruits of their research must also be translated in the criteria of selection, arrangement of artworks, programs and events, and the institutional organization of the museum.
It may be the case that representing every single artist, art movement, period, technique, culture, and group will prove almost impossible given the diversity in the Philippines. But an institution such as the National Museum of Fine Arts, which implicitly claims its position as the epicenter of Philippine art history and identity, ought to at least make greater efforts in representing as much as they could. By only representing specific artists and art movements, they are alleging, consciously or otherwise, that these are the only types of art that the Philippines has. Or worse, that these are the only types of art that actually matter. Perhaps the argument could be raised that not everything derived from different time periods or different ethno-linguistic groups can be considered fine art. In other words, not all artifacts are necessarily fine art. However, when the museum not merely places an emphasis on a certain time period's artworks, implying that fine art only existed in this area during this time, say the Spanish colonial period in Luzon. But when it places actual objects of cultural heritage that are not fine art but are merely artifacts, in the National Museum's case, church retablos from the Spanish occupation, and even fire hydrants from Old Manila, it is clear that it not anymore is an argument as to what can be considered fine art. It is a question of whose voices can and should be heard. If the National Museum acknowledges that although it is difficult to represent each and every culture, it still attempts to be as faithful in representing as they could, then it affirms these cultures, these voices that for so long have been either silenced, gentrified, or outright ostracized. It acknowledges that these artworks and the people behind them, as well as the social political realities of these artists, and it affirms that these works of art have value. Perhaps it is difficult for individuals in the art scene to recognize these artworks' intrinsic value, For example, artists and art curators who have been adept in more westernized forms of art may not immediately recognize the artistic merit of more oriental forms of art. Yet that only further affirms that these formerly ignored forms of art have to be displayed and recognized. More than their artistic value, however, having different works of art exhibited not only in the museum, but alongside each other help contextualize each artwork further. Not to juxtapose one art over another and have them there as points for comparison, but to further enrich the discourse that the audience has with the art, the artists, and their realities. Perhaps most significant is the acknowledgement that these forms of art, such as for example the fabrics of the Tiboli dreamweavers or the wood carvings of Mindanao Islamic art, are as effective conduits for conveying messages of social political realities as the works of, say, Luna or Bencab, such as the case of the Yellow Ambiguities exhibition in the Ateneo Art Gallery, where the Maranao Malong is placed in the same space as that of an Amor Solo and the Our Lady of Peña Francia. There is this affirmation that different backgrounds and cultures are not only represented, but are also as capable of expressing and providing social commentary, as art is inclined to do so.
Understanding these, it is imperative for museums to allow social actions in order to contribute towards the progress of national culture and awareness. This brought about because art, as well as museums, are itself inherently agents for social change. Learning from Emily ONUFER through a simple exhibition she made to bring awareness for a local Richmond transit through the eyes of its citizens, the small foreign exchange speaks volumes towards the value of art as more than just static. Art moves along with its audience through history, speaking from the perspective of the artists as they continually wish to impart an insight in the form of exhibitions and collections. One way for change to be healthily be fulfilled by museums is to sustain it in the form of expository unbiased exhibitions such as that of Emily ONUFER's. These exhibitions intent on showcasing art regardless of its political stances on pressing issues, encourage facts over opinion, and displaying the reality of what's happening in the world both the artists and the audience are living in. This is guaranteed to happen because of the way that art affects the viewer. While the audience views a controversial piece, emotion runs rampant as the viewer not only sees the message but are affected by it. They may feel awe, wonder, inspiration, disgust, anger, hopelessness, or love from its message, and are then inspired to act from it. Museums must then not only cultivate these said emotions and isolate them, but allow for the viewer to experience all of it. The Philippine National Museum must allow this, as it is in the center of a nation that desperately thirsts for change. However, to understand merely one side of the situation, whether it be the morally correct form of action, will yield disastrous consequences. This is caused by the misinformation that plagues the refusal of people to see the other side, especially with the Philippines' current president. Due to his lack of empathy and reason to understand the humane side of the government's war against drugs, change to compromise the rehabilitation of criminals are often suppressed. He is ultimately unaware of unsuccessful drug wars in the past, especially in Mexico and the USA. Continued uninformed perpetuation repeats the same history, with Brazil participating in drug-related extrajudicial killings now. Taking all of this in, museums, especially national museums, hold the responsibility of bringing up art as not just for its beauty, but for its information. They are not merely artists, but teachers and historians as well, seeing to it that the audience form opinions on their own, solidifying it by understanding every position from every voice.